Sure, so my name is James, and at the moment I'm studying a master's degree at ANU's in neuroscience, and so my interests lie kind of at the intersection between, I guess, psychology, neuroscience, and like computer science. So I'm interested in understanding human cognition, how we think and reason, and belief formation and things like that. So at the moment well, this year I'm going to be starting my thesis, where I'm probably going to be looking at trying to construct computational models of well, some neural process, to be determined exactly what yet. Looking to next year start a PhD, hopefully working on sort of similar areas. Okay, so in terms of the types of neural network models that I'd be looking at working on, I think it's important to kind of start small and build up, so to speak. So I'm not looking at like whole brain emulation or anything close to that at this point. We're far away from being able to do that. Particularly what I'm really interested in is being able to see if we can understand the fairly basic processes that the brain uses to operate, particularly something called synaptic plasticity. So this refers to how the strength of the connections between neurons changes over time. It's thought that synaptic plasticity is responsible for memory formation and consolidation, and obviously that's a hugely important mental phenomenon. It kind of underpins pretty much everything else. And so we need to be able to understand that if we're going to understand how we change our minds about things and how we form beliefs and think about things. So at the moment there are lots of models of how synaptic plasticity works, as in like mathematical formulae and some computational accounts. The problem with that is that they haven't really been tested to see if they describe how actual neurons work. They often seem to be operating at a more abstract level, which is kind of okay, but at the end of the day you do need to see whether that more abstract level actually describes the reality of it, to see if you're actually describing how the brain actually works or if you're just doing something else. For a lot of more like industry or computer science applications, they don't necessarily care, but from my point of view I do care about what the actual brain is doing. So one of the things I'm looking at doing is to see whether we can use the more abstract models and then collect data about how the strength of neural connections actually changes over time, and see effectively whether the model predicts what actually happens. So there's actually many different models or like formulae that have been proposed, and really none of them have been tested very specifically against real neural data. So that's one of the things I'm looking at doing. Another thing that I'm looking at doing is seeing if we can understand how information is propagated through a neural network, that is like a biological neural network as opposed to an artificial one. Again, there are many models and equations and formulations that are used in industry and in more abstract models, and often the idea is kind of that they're inspired by the brain and real neurons, but they don't necessarily have to or are intended to describe them in detail. But again, if we want to understand what the brain is actually doing, which I do, then we kind of need to see how well these models actually apply to like real neurons. And so one of the challenges there is trying to figure out how to measure the relevant things in a like a real brain or part of a brain. Because in an artificial neural network there's like the input and then the middle, well, the hidden nodes they're called, and then the output. And you can control that precisely because you decide what the input is and how to measure the output. But in a real brain, it's not really clear what the input is and what the output is. And so there has to be a way to kind of operationalize that and measure the right things, and then find a way to compare those results to the thing that we have simulated. So there are a lot of tricky questions there about how to do that. But again, this hasn't been done too much because most people are kind of interested in just either looking at the brain itself or in modeling things quite abstractly. So that's another thing that I'm interested in doing. So I became interested in neuroscience, particularly computational neuroscience, quite a few years ago now, largely through my interest in actually other social sciences, particularly economics, because economics and things like also psychology and sociology and so forth, they study human behavior as well, but at a sort of higher level. And I was interested in those because I wanted to understand like how human societies work, why some nations succeed, why some fail historically and in the current world, why some economies are successful, why trends take off, all of these sorts of interesting questions about societies, and that they're still of interest to me. But what I found a bit frustrating is the models used particularly in economics, which has a more formal approach, but in other disciplines as well. They're really very crude. That is, we don't really understand very well about how humans think and reason and then behave. We understand some, but it's a very, as I said, crude level of understanding. So I became more interested in, well, what have, in particular neuroscience, what has that discipline contributed? Because that's supposed to like understand the brain, right? Which is where we make these decisions and where we decide how to behave and where we learn and respond to other people. So this is where it's all happening, right? And I was sort of frustrated to learn as I learned a bit more about it that, well, it hasn't really been able to answer these questions very well because our understanding is so limited. So that's why I became more interested in seeing, well, you know, is there an avenue of sort of making more progress here? And when I learned a bit more about kind of neural networks and machine learning and a kind of a computational information processing approach to neuroscience, which isn't super new, but it is relatively new. I guess it dates to kind of the 80s, late 80s, around the same time artificial neural networks sort of really came into vogue. Yeah, so, and people started to apply these computational approaches to neural systems. And so this has been done for a couple of decades now, but it's still quite new, and we're still really lacking a lot of fundamental theory about just how to approach the sorts of questions, like sort of, you know, what do we measure? And how do we apply a theory to that? Because there's so many things you can measure in a brain, and like people do different things in different studies. So there's a lot of, I guess, unexplored space. And so one of the reasons I became interested in moving into neuroscience is because I thought that I could do some useful work here that hadn't been done before and that may not get done or get done for a while. And also because it's quite an interdisciplinary field. I think that there's scope for drawing on methods and insights from at least psychology, computer science, and neuroscience, and possibly other fields as well. And interdisciplinarity is of interest to me. I think it's a good way to make progress, is to combine ideas or bring in ideas from different fields. And so my basic drive is the idea that if we can understand at a fundamental level how humans think and reason, that will allow us to construct much better models and theories in the social sciences about how humans behave and interact with each other in a social setting. Because the social scientific theories are based on assumptions about human behavior, sometimes explicitly, sometimes kind of implicitly, but they are always there. And the idea being, well, if we understood that more at a fundamental level, like we do in the other sciences, that biology is based on chemistry, which is based on physics, I feel like that we could have a much more robust and detailed and ultimately more explanatory set of theories. So that's obviously a longer term ambition, but that's what got me interested in neuroscience, like computational neuroscience originally. In terms of the types of simulations that I'm looking at doing, these wouldn't have any immediate or sort of even medium-term relevance in terms of data science, machine learning, because they'd be way smaller in particular, and the amount of data we have is not nearly large enough to train the sort of big models that people are working on. So the idea, though, is that even very complicated deep learning and other types of algorithms are based on relatively simple basic principles, like the architecture of the system, so how the nodes are connected, how the nodes, the connections between the nodes update from like one iteration to the next, the functions that describe how each node like activates in response to its inputs, things like this, and then you put them together and you train it with huge data sets, and that's how the models work. So what I'm interested in doing is trying to understand or like test better those basic elements and look at. So the idea is that these basic elements, in some sense, in an abstract sense, represent what's happening in the brain. But that's what I want to test. So I want to try to take those elements, like how synaptic weights are updated, or what are called activation functions, so how neurons' activity changes in response to their inputs, and the architecture of the networks. So I want to test those at a smaller scale, see whether they're actually, like whether our models describe what the brain is doing, or whether they need tweaking, as they probably do, or like which of the models are more relevant, and so forth. Then the idea is if we can kind of validate that and learn more about how the brain actually works, we can build up bigger systems again, but on a more firm foundation, on the basis of, well, we've tested these on a smaller scale, and so we're sort of confident that at least in this context, they model what the brain's doing. And then we can build bigger systems using them. And it's sort of unclear exactly how much that will change. I think it will probably change quite a number of things relative to what's done in machine learning, because that's been built on only like at a very crude level, inspired by the brain, not based on what the brain is doing. So that's my kind of ambition longer term as to why this might be useful. A lot of people are interested in and asking questions about the potential capabilities and sort of extrapolating of how big data and machine learning are able to seemingly do so many things, recognize faces and make predictions for us and, drive cars and all sorts of other stuff, and where the limits to that might be. And one of the areas that some people have expressed as being a distinct difference between how these sort of machine learning algorithms work and how humans work is that machine learning algorithms basically operate by making, observing a lot of correlations and structure in a large data set. And learning patterns from that. Whereas humans, they sort of do that, but we do it in quite a different ways by identifying causal regularities, consciously or unconsciously, and kind of building internal models on the basis of that. And so there seems to be a significant difference there. So leading on from that is a question as to, can we say much about how humans do this? Like, how do we learn about causal links, or how do we identify causal connections between things? People say correlation isn't causation, but well, then how do we learn about causation if it's not just from correlations? I think, unfortunately, neuroscience and even psychology doesn't have that much to say about this so far. A lot of psychological studies, well, a number of them have focused on this question, but from my point of view, well, I don't find the methodology very satisfactory, because often it's sort of like they'll present people with different cases or different stories or accounts and tweak them a little bit, and they'll see, like, does the person identify a causal relationship here, or do they do it in this case, and so forth, and then they try to sort of see where the difference is. And that's somewhat useful, but it's still hard to say what's actually going on, particularly at a computational level that is in the mind. And that's what I'm kind of interested in, as to what processes are being carried out at a neuronal level that lead us to be able to make causal inferences, and at other times not. And so this field is sometimes called causal learning, and it's something I'm very interested in. My opinion about this is that causal learning is part of a process by which we construct internal mental models of how things work in the world, and then kind of make extrapolations, effectively running mental simulations. We can do this consciously. You can just imagine something and sort of play it through. But I think we can also do it unconsciously as well. And we just sort of get in the habit of doing that when we, like, for example, if we see an object teetering on the edge of the table, we might not, like, mentally see it fall off and smash or something, but we're kind of doing that when we, implicitly, when we reach over and move it so it doesn't fall off. We haven't needed to, we may not have ever seen an object like that. Indeed, maybe this is a totally new environment to us. So it's not like we've kind of extrapolated from past experience in a purely, like, correlational way. I think that we have an understanding of kind of how objects, like heavy objects, fall to the ground and things like that. There's some more underlying internal model that we have. And what I would like to understand better is how we learn that. I have some vague ideas about this. It's kind of too early to say exactly how these are going to fit together, but I think a very important part of this is basically our early childhood. So when we're born, we're exposed to a huge range of experiences before we even learn to speak, and then before we learn to really reason explicitly or abstractly about things. And so there's a whole host of knowledge that we're bringing to bear that we gain during this period. And I think that understanding how, kind of, if you like, our networks are being trained during this period to understand basic things, including, like, manipulating physical objects and also social interactions and other things, I think that might be part of it. So I think that we're kind of building up this very rich internal knowledge structure that we don't even necessarily have explicit access to a lot of the time. And language fits into that as well. Language shapes how we think about a lot of things. So I would like to understand that more at a neuronal level, and I'm optimistic that in the coming decades we'll be able to learn more about that through neuroscientific investigation. Is mind uploading possible? So that's a big question. The short answer, I think, is yes. It's obviously not possible now. I think it will be possible on the order of 50 to 100 years, is my guess of the technological development. Of course, that's assuming we don't, have nuclear war or something. But in terms of unpacking that a bit more, so mind uploading would be something like taking a scan of someone's brain. Somewhat unclear whether this would happen while they're alive or perhaps once they die, but putting that aside, we'd take a very detailed scan of their brain, which would presumably involve the connectivity, measuring the connectivity between maybe not all of the neurons, but enough of the neurons in their brain to be able to then reconstruct that in a digital simulation, and then being able to then run that simulation to a sufficiently high fidelity that then effectively produces a digital copy of the mechanisms that gave rise to their thoughts and inner dialogue, effectively their consciousness. So there's a whole host of questions about that in terms of like philosophically, would it feel something? I tend to think that if simulated in the correct way, it would, but that's a trickier question that I don't want to say too much about right now. But a few of the technical issues that are relevant, one of them is that it's not just enough to be able to, so you could do a structural scan of someone's brain which could measure the neurons and all their connectivities. That in itself wouldn't be enough, because we need to know the strength of the connectivities, the synaptic connections between the neurons. And interestingly, we don't really know what the structural basis of that is at the moment. I mean, we do sort of know. We know it relates to the formation of physical synaptic connections and the number of ion channels, but it's very complicated because they're regulated by like other receptors, and there's the degree of expression of particular proteins within the cell affects how much the ion channels will open and how quickly they'll close, and a whole bunch of factors like that. And you can't measure that just by looking at the neuron and what it connects to. So it's quite unclear how we would measure all of that information. Theoretically, if you measured like the position of every atom in someone's brain and was able to replicate that, then you should be able to replicate the functioning. But that level of detail is much, much further off, and it's unclear whether we'll ever sort of reach that level of ability. Of course, it's also true that you're not going to have to get every atom exactly right. There's, if that were the case, then a slight change in your blood pH, or if someone just knocks you slightly, then that would change some atoms in your brain, and then you would be a different person, right? So that doesn't happen. So luckily, the brain is quite adaptable to change. So we wouldn't have to get everything perfectly right, but we would have to get things enough right. And yeah, I think that ability to measure all of the relevant, particularly what's called like functional factors about the activity of the different neurons, is very unclear how we would do that. We don't have anything like that capability now. The other side to it is, of course, then we need to be able to run this simulation, and computationally we don't have that ability now. When we will get that ability depends on progress in like developing computer hardware, but it also depends on the level of detail that we need to be able to run the simulation up. If we have to simulate every atom, then that's going to take a lot longer than if we just have to simulate each neuron as a sort of an element with then different parameters and variables. I don't think we would need to simulate every atom, but the real issue is we might need to perform measurements at a certain level of detail and then translate that into a model in a more indirect way. So maybe we simulate each neuron, but there's a whole bunch of parameters that we have to set for that neuron that have to be measured experimentally. And there may be some sort of process of transformations and computations. It may not just be straightforward, you measure it and it goes in the simulation. There may be a process of reconstruction that goes on there that could be kind of complicated, and there may be sort of, well, certainly early on, there's going to be like approximations and guesses. So I wouldn't want to be the first person on whom this was tried. Well, especially if it was a destructive process, which it almost certainly would be at first. That is, you had to destroy the brain in order to put it in a computer, because it's much easier to it's much easier to measure things and make all the required measurements if we can destroy the tissue, because the best way to perform these measurements is to slice the tissue up in very small slices and kind of scan that in. But of course you don't have a brain afterwards. So I guess if you're already dead, then you're not going to worry so much. But so there's a whole host of different questions about the process in terms of like, does it happen when you're alive or after you're dead? Is it destructive or not? What level of detail it needs to be performed at? So I don't think those are going to be answered anytime soon. In principle, though, I do think it will be possible. There's a lot of evidence emerging from neuroscience that the details of what's happening inside a neuron are very important. So this includes the expression of different genes and the types of proteins, like the variants there are, how many ion channels are expressed and what variants they are of that. Even like position of microtubules within the cell, which affects things like cell shape and the structure and how it connects with other neurons, and probably other things that I don't even know about is yet. Oh, vesicles as well, which release neurotransmitters. So all of that stuff matters for the function of a neuron. It doesn't necessarily follow, though, that we have to be able to measure all those things and directly incorporate them into the simulation, because the mainstream theory in neuroscience is that really what matters for neural processing and like thought and all of the stuff that we care about is the transfer of electrical signals from one cell to another, and like when that happens and the strength of the signals and so forth. The idea, though, if that's true, then all we need to replicate is that pattern of functionality. And we could do it using different methods, or using different instantiations than what the brain does. I mean, at a most fundamental level, that's what we're doing when we do a computer simulation instead of running the thing in actual neurons. But that could also apply at a more specific level. That is, we don't necessarily need to simulate in a computer all of the inner workings of a cell, like the DNA and the RNA machinery that then reads the DNA and produces the proteins. That would introduce a whole level of extra complexity into the simulation. It may be all right. It may be appropriate to be able to construct simpler models of neurons that where we can replicate the functionings of them using basically just internal parameters or simple functions inside the computer. But they would need to be calibrated against real neurons, and there are many different types of neurons. So it's somewhat unclear. We don't really know how much individual neurons vary from each other. They certainly vary a lot from each other in terms of shape and in terms of functional characteristics, but is there a way that we could measure the relevant parameters and then parameterize that without having to directly simulate everything within the cell? We don't know. I suspect that probably will be possible. I hope it will be possible. If it's not possible, then our ability to understand what the brain's doing is going to be dramatically reduced, because basically we have to look at everything at a molecular level instead of a cellular level. I would say the mainstream view is that the cellular level is kind of where it's at, but whether we can understand the cellular level kind of on its own terms, or whether we really need to delve into the molecular level to make sense of it, is, I think, an open question at this point. One idea is that we might be able to kind of gradually augment the brain. I guess you could start with perhaps genetic engineering, but also implants, external or internal, and then kind of add to that, and then gradually sort of transition away from the biological brain to the artificial implants, and then rather than trying to scan everything at once, you sort of do it in a gradual way. I think in principle this is probably a good idea, because the brain is very plastic, which means it's very good at adapting to changes. So if you put an implant in there, of course it has to be has to be constructed and designed correctly, but it doesn't have to, you don't have to know everything about how the brain works in order to get that interface to work. We already do this to a modest extent with things like the bionic ear, which are able to work even though actually the brain's kind of doing most of the work. It does all the learning about how to interpret the signals that are produced using that device. So in principle, if we were able to make these devices more compact and with more electrodes and more processing power and other things like that, the brain could learn how to use them. How far we'd then be able to ultimately shift away from the biological brain to these artificial devices is less clear, but that's potentially another avenue as well that wouldn't require a kind of one-off reconstruction or destruction of the original brain. But again, these things are a ways off at the moment, but in principle I think that might work.
Okay, so the maturity of the technology to do this and the time at which this maturity becomes available completely aside, if there was anybody in history who you'd like to, who, if it were possible, you could upload or reanimate or effectively resurrect, who would it be and why?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. If I could resurrect or reanimate one person from history, who would it be? It's hard to choose one, obviously. I thought a bit about this, and I think my answer would be, I don't necessarily have a singular person. I probably have to do a bit more research, but someone who lived, like a scholar who lived in late antiquity, probably in the late Roman times. And the reason I say that is because if they're in the late Roman times, then they have access to kind of all classical learning before them, much of which has subsequently been lost. And I'm a bibliophile. I like books and learning and the history of thought and so on. And the quantity of scholarship that we have that survived from the classical period, so I'm talking about Greece and Rome, is minuscule. Like there are some authors that we know they wrote like 40 things, and we have just a few snippets of them surviving. And so someone who had in their brain, especially because they probably have more of it memorized than we would, because they didn't have access to printed books or anything. If we could bring back one of those people and just one of those persons and just ask them questions about who were these people and what did they say, I think that would be a huge boon for scholarly knowledge. So there might be more kind of interesting people to bring back and ask them, I don't know, like Alexander the Great or someone. But I think in terms of like contributing to human knowledge, actually someone who had access to that classical learning would be perhaps the most useful.
What minds today would you like to would you hope that they sign up for cryonics and preserve their brains so that future generations can benefit from their insight or their particular nuanced way of looking at the world? Or
What minds would I want to sign up for cryonics today so that we could preserve for the future? Another interesting question. Kind of building on my previous answer, I'm interested in preserving different experiences and ways of thinking. So people who are very old but still kind of healthy and have their faculty about them, I'd like some of them, because there aren't really any people who remember the 19th century anymore, but there are still people who remember the early 20th century and the world wars and so on. So it'd be great to preserve some of that first-hand experience. People from different cultures as well. People from the developing world would be especially interesting, because I hope and think that much of the world's going to become developed over the course of the next 50 to 100 years. And so we won't have people who have first-hand experience with dire poverty or like living in a rural subsistence lifestyle. And that's going to be good, because it's not nice to live in those circumstances, but it would be nice to preserve the experience in terms of the knowledge of it. And I mean, of course, we can do that through books and film and so on, but having a person who actually lived it is different, and I think provides a richer understanding of that. So being able to preserve that would be good as well. So I think I'm probably less interested in saying, I want to preserve the Elon Musks or the the Peter Singers or whoever else, as great as they would be to have. But I think that future generations are going to be able to build upon us in terms of our scientific and philosophical knowledge a lot anyway. And if we brought back a great scientist or philosopher from 100 years ago, it'd be great to talk to them, but I don't really think that they necessarily still be able to add a lot, or at least they'd have to learn a lot about what's happened since. But I think being able to sort of preserve people for a sort of a cultural, ethnographical point of view is at least of more interest to me. If I had to pick 5 people, say, I'd probably base it on that.
Interesting. Yeah, very good answer, by the way. Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of agree in a sense that it would be great to be able to record sort of modes of experience that would have been unique to their place and time at different periods in history, instead of just record somebody with a lot of information about technical details, which we could learn anyway about today, or we already have that knowledge now. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking maybe it would be interesting to get like an early scientist's interpretation of how the world's attitude towards the new ideas coming about.
Well, it would be fascinating to see what Newton thinks of modern physics and quantum mechanics and so on. I suspect he probably wouldn't like it at all, but that's just a guess.